Hello everyone, Mark Hertzler here, aka Dagorath. Today I want to talk about the use of Valacyclovir for chronic fatigue syndrome and my experience with it. If you want the long story short, just want the headline, nutshell version of what happened with me, I can say that it was the single best treatment, medication or otherwise, that I've ever used for chronic fatigue syndrome. It gave me over 2 years of complete remission of all my symptoms. And yeah, there's no other medication that even comes close to that. That said, my treatment and the success of it was limited. After 2 years and about 3 months, the medication just stopped working completely, and I've had to come off the medication now because it hasn't been working for a while now. That said, you know, over 2 years of complete symptom relief is better than nothing. And if you want to stick around and see what are the details of what happened with me and what I went through, stick around, because that's what this video is going to be about. So first of all, I want to do an overview of what Valacyclovir is and why it's prescribed for chronic fatigue syndrome. It's been around for a couple decades now, the prescription for chronic fatigue syndrome using this medication, and it was first used by Dr. Lerner, who was a physician who actually had chronic fatigue syndrome himself, and he found that a lot of his patients and himself had high levels of antibodies for Epstein-Barr virus, herpes number 6, and a couple other viruses. And since Epstein-Barr virus and herpes 6 are part of the herpes virus family, I believe there's about 8 viruses included. It's not just oral and genital herpes. It's not just an STD. It's a series of viruses that basically cause cold-like symptoms. Epstein-Barr virus itself is cause of mono and things like lymphoma, and it's estimated that over 90% of the world's adult population has been infected with Epstein-Barr virus. So there shouldn't be any stigma around it being in the herpes family. Anyway, since Valacyclovir and other antivirals were used to treat genital herpes and oral herpes, Dr. Lerner hypothesized that you could possibly use Valacyclovir to treat chronic Epstein-Barr virus infections, which he thought were the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. So that's exactly what he did, and he apparently fixed his own chronic fatigue syndrome using Valacyclovir, and he used it on patients for, I think, almost 2 decades, and he got fairly positive results. And he got such good positive results that people in the medical community, especially in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years or so, have started looking at his work and actually using it as the foundation for diagnosis for chronic fatigue syndrome and treatment for chronic fatigue syndrome. So there's clinics like Stanford who are actually using Dr. Lerner's method to treat patients with, according to them, a lot of success. There hasn't been a huge double-blind placebo trial to actually confirm scientifically, concretely, that antivirals work to treat and cure maybe chronic fatigue syndrome, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence supporting it, and that's why these major institutions are picking up on this treatment. Also to note that the Center of Disease Control in America also lists the Epstein-Barr virus and treatment with antivirals as a possible diagnosis and treatment of the condition. So it is gaining some mainstream acceptability. That said, again, there have been no large-scale double-blind placebo trials to really confirm and prove that is an effective treatment. Despite that, it's a fairly safe medication. We've been using it for a long time. People use it for, as I said, genital herpes, as well as I think people like HIV and various other conditions. And they don't have a terrible lot of side effects. Some people do get side effects, but it's pretty rare. So, what was my experience with it? Well, I first came down with chronic fatigue syndrome after an Epstein-Barr virus infection in 2012. My doctor tested specifically for that infection because we thought I had mono at first. I didn't have mono, I just had the Epstein-Barr. And that kind of set me off to look on the internet about what the Epstein-Barr virus is, and that's how I came across Dr. Lerner's hypothesis about the origin of chronic fatigue syndrome with the Epstein-Barr virus and his treatment with it. I couldn't get my primary physician to prescribe it. He just didn't know about it, and he didn't think it was a good idea. Later that year in 2012, I saw an infectious disease specialist who I brought it up again. He didn't really like the idea of it. He never heard of it. But after a while, he decided just what the hell, and he gave me a prescription for 1 gram a day of Valacyclovir. I took it for about 3 months, and I didn't notice any changes whatsoever. There were no positive effects I felt from the medication, and there were no negative effects I felt from the medication. It was pretty discouraging. I read online that it could take over 3 months to get results, but after 3 months of no results, my infectious disease doctor didn't want me taking the medication for longer, just because he thought it was a liability in case I got side effects, and he's prescribing it for something that's technically off-label. So he pulled me off of it, and since I got no really great results from it, and it's not like totally confirmed that it worked for chronic fatigue, I kind of just let it go for a while. I couldn't find a doctor to prescribe it, and I was tired of trying to convince these doctors to let me prescribe it, even because there's not even like a whole lot of great data to even, persuade them to do so. Anyway, flash forward to 2016, I saw a new infectious disease doctor who was testing me for everything under the sun, and he genuinely seemed like he wanted to help me. And finally, he came across the Stanford information on their protocol for treating chronic fatigue syndrome, and I also was aware of it, and we decided to try another course of Valacyclovir. So this time, we decided to do 1 gram a day also, but do it for an indefinite period of time. So longer period of time, more than just the first 3-month trial that I tried before. And this time when I started taking it, my symptoms got a lot worse right at first. In the first 3 months, I was having some of the worst fatigue symptoms I had ever had since I first got diagnosed. I was having flare-ups more frequently that were more severe. I have intermittent chronic fatigue, but when it gets really bad, it's like having the flu every week, basically, and just having like maybe a couple days of feeling okay in between the next flare-up. So that was happening for a few months, and then finally, around the 4-month mark or so, I had remission from my chronic fatigue, which is not uncommon since I have it off and on, basically weekly or bi-weekly. I had a remission, but after a week, the chronic fatigue did not come back. I didn't have a flare-up again, like I almost always did the previous 6 years. Or 4 years, sorry. And that went on. After 2 weeks, there was no flare-up. After a month, no flare-up. After 2 months, no flare-up. And that went on and on and on for 2 years, over 2 years. And at first, I was pretty, I don't know if you call it skeptical, I was just reserved, cautious, because I had had remissions naturally with like no medication at all for 3.5 months. Like it wasn't uncommon for me to have a very long period of not having a flare-up. So at first I was like, it could possibly just be me having one of my natural remission relapse cycles, and this is just a particularly long remission for me. But at the 6-month mark, it was like, that'd be double the length of my longest period of time with no symptoms before, so it was like, maybe there is something to this. And definitely after the 1 year mark, and even then, like I was still being cautious, and then after the 2 year mark, I was like, okay, there has to be something to this. There's no way that this could just be a natural flux in my disease process, because this has never happened, nothing close to this have ever happened before. And at this point, I was finally going around, I didn't want to jinx it before by saying I was like cured. I was like basically going around saying, I've basically been cured by Valtrex. I wasn't preaching it to people, but if people asked me how my chronic fatigue was going or why I was taking Valtrex, I would say it got rid of my chronic fatigue. Yeah, again, I wasn't like preaching out there, but I started saying that when people asked me about it. And then, of course, I guess I jinxed it, because I think 2 years and 3.5 months, I finally had another relapse. My chronic fatigue came back. I was still on the Valacyclovir. And then it just fell into the same cycle as before. It's been doing this for a few months now, of just having flare-up for 2 to 7 days, feeling okay for 2 to 7 days, flare up 2 to 7 days, while I'm still taking the Valtrex. So about a month ago I decided to just drop the medication. My doctors agreed with me, because I'm taking so many other medications that if it's not working, I might as well just drop it, because I'm already on enough as it is. So that's my experience with it. It gave me over 2 years of symptom-free chronic fatigue. And when I say symptom-free, I don't mean like there's a lot of medications out there, like even like caffeine, that can kind of just dull the edge of chronic fatigue, give you, a little more comfortability, a little more energy. Caffeine, Tylenol, ibuprofen, pain medicine, sleeping medication. There's these things that can kind of treat the symptoms of chronic fatigue, right? But the cool thing about what Valtrex did is it didn't feel like it was just treating the symptoms. It felt like it was treating the source of the problem. And because of that, it wasn't like a dulling of the symptoms, just making the symptoms more manageable. It was the symptoms did not exist anymore. And that was a feeling of really great relief after having the disease for over 4 years at the time. I finally got the relief from Valacyclovir. Unfortunately, we originally planned like I would just be on Valacyclovir indefinitely and it would control my symptoms, but that obviously wasn't the case. I don't know exactly why that happened. On Stanford's website and also on other medical websites, they say that while the Epstein-Barr virus and other viruses are suspect in being kind of the inciting incident for chronic fatigue syndrome, there's debate as to whether the virus is actually causing the symptoms on a chronic basis. And on Stanford's website, they say one of the theories is that the virus started the symptoms, but it's some sort of inflammatory autoimmune reaction to the virus that then causes the chronic symptoms, which would explain why 90% of adults test positive for Epstein-Barr virus, but only a very small percentage of adults have chronic fatigue syndrome, right? So that said, it did something. It seemed like to some degree it was beating back the virus. I'm a person who does not really have placebo effect when I take medication. I've taken like probably close to probably in the triple digits of the prescription drugs I've taken and supplements over the years. So to me, I take something and it either works or it doesn't. I get the side effects or I don't. I'm a type of person who I don't think something is working until it actually works. So I kind of try to judge things in the most objective way possible, at least for myself. Obviously, there's probably some subjective bias, but to give me over 2 years of symptom relief when the longest I've gone is 3 months, and that was like being generous, having a 3-month period of no symptoms. That was like the longest time ever. Usually it's like 2 weeks is a good amount of time for me to go without symptoms. So to go 2 years, I think, is more than placebo. And the results that other people have had with it, that institutions like Stanford, who are reputable, have had with it, I think it says something. I think there's something to using antivirals for chronic fatigue syndrome, and even though it did not last on a permanent basis, I wouldn't take those 2 years back for anything. I mean, getting 2 years relief from a chronic, debilitating disease is awesome. So, if you guys have had any experience with Valacyclovir or the other antivirals, leave it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm hoping to get into the Stanford's chronic fatigue clinic pretty soon here. I know there's like a 6-month waiting list, but hopefully that'll happen sometime next year. And maybe we'll try me on one of the other antivirals, because I know there's, I think, like 3 different ones people have tried for chronic fatigue syndrome. If there are any other medications that you think were great, share your story in the comments below. Just putting this out there for educational purposes. I'm not saying everyone with chronic fatigue should be on Valtrex or this or this or that. You kind of got to find what works for you. And I just hope this helps you make a better decision about what you want to try and help some of you out there. So, that's all I have for you today. Wish you all good luck with your chronic fatigue and whatever else, or if you're just tuning in for educational purposes. Hope this helped you. Alright, bye.